Hello, my name's Celia Halsey, and I've been working with CW Plus, which is the charity which supports Chelsea and Westminster Hospital, to help them put together an exhibition which we opened last year on the lower ground floor in the outpatients department on the heritage of this remarkable hospital. The hospital is just over 300 years old. It has many stories to tell. And in the process of putting together that exhibition, we discovered countless photographs and archives and records, which we simply couldn't fit into that exhibition. So I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to share with you a few of those photographs and to share some stories and help you discover a little bit about this hospital and all it has to tell us. So I've put together an album, a collection of photographs, and I thought it'd be interesting to look at some of the photographs recording the role that this hospital has played in times of conflict over the last 200 years. It's had a very pivotal role in very many national emergencies, and I think it's been inspirational and humbling to look at some of these pictures. So I'd like to share them with you. So I'm going to show you the beginning of our next album. I've called it Westminster Hospital on the Front Line. On the front line. I'm going to take us back to begin with, just over 200 years, to the Napoleonic Wars. And here's a picture of the Battle of Toulouse, which took place in 1814. It was when the British and the Spanish had pushed the French back out of Spain and Portugal at the end of the Peninsular Wars and had pushed them back as far as Toulouse, where they surrounded the city and defeated the French. On that battlefield was a very remarkable man whose name was George Guthrie. He was extraordinary in that he had been an army surgeon from the age of 13. In those days, you didn't have to have any qualifications, but when the law changed and doctors and surgeons at long last had to actually pass some exams before they were allowed to operate on you, in 1814, he found himself on the battlefield, but he had been taken some exams from the Royal College of Surgeons. He had taken them at 2 days' notice, and he had passed, aged 16. He then went off and served in the Peninsular Wars, where he became a very adept eye surgeon in particular. And it was at this battle that he collected some specimens which he preserved. George Guthrie became subsequently a member of the staff at Westminster Hospital in 1823, and by that time he was known to be the most preeminent surgeon in England. He was a Scotsman. I think he was quite fiery. By all accounts, he was shrewd and robust and voluble to a fault. I think he had quite a lot to say for himself. I think he had seen an extraordinary amount of action in very difficult circumstances on the battlefield. But his experiences he brought back with him to Westminster Hospital. And those specimens of gunshot wounds of bones, which he had collected at the Battle of Toulouse, he actually ended up in the very first museum of specimens at the new medical school that he helped to found. When he first came back to London after those Napoleonic Wars, he helped to found the Westminster Eye Hospital, which subsequently in 1947 amalgamated and is now part of Moorfields Eye Hospital. But he was a Westminster man, and he was a preeminent surgeon at the hospital for many years. And then in 1834, he was the founder member of the new medical school at Westminster Hospital. I think he was quite a character. We're moving on now to the mid-19th century and the Crimean War. Alfred Marshall, we know very little about him apart from the fact that he was a student at the new Westminster Hospital Medical School under Guthrie. He was quite a brilliant student. He demonstrated anatomy from a very young age, early on in his career. He became a house surgeon in the hospital. And then in 1854, he joined up to the army and went off to the Crimea, where he served as a doctor. And here he is in his uniform, looking very, very dapper. But all we know about him is that sadly he died on a troop ship on his way home from the Crimean War in 1858. But he wasn't the only member of Westminster staff actually out in the Crimea during that war. Of course, there's a very famous person that we all associate with the Crimean War in the form of Florence Nightingale. And we have, or better say, we had in our possession at Westminster Hospital a very precious letter from Florence Nightingale to Westminster Hospital. I'm saying we had because it's a puzzle we've discovered in looking through the archives. We knew about this letter and we were convinced that it was in the archives somewhere. We have spent hours and hours trawling through our archives, sorting them out and working out which of those archives are going to be deposited at the London Metropolitan Archives, hoping to find this letter. And we got very excited when we found a folder which said that it contained a letter from Miss Nightingale, and opened it, and it was empty. We do not know where this letter has gone. This picture I've got of it here is actually a scan from a book which was printed in 1974 to commemorate 250 years of Westminster Hospital. So we know that it was in possession of the hospital in 1974, but we don't know what's happened to it since. So if anybody knows who might have taken it away for safekeeping, we'd love to hear from you. But I'm going to read it out to you because it's really charming. So this is a letter from Florence Nightingale. It's dated from Scutari, which is where she had her famous hospital, August the 13th, that must be my birthday actually, 1855. Sir, Miss Mary Tattersall, now a nurse under my charge at Scutari, who passed through an apprenticeship at your hospital, desires now to forward to you £5 for the Westminster Hospital, being, as she says, the first money that she has earned, which she earnestly wishes to donate to the place where she received so much kindness when learning there. I remain, sir, your obedient servant, Florence Nightingale. So we know that Miss Mary Tattersall had trained as a nurse at Westminster Hospital and then gone out to the Crimea to join Florence Nightingale, and was clearly well regarded by Florence Nightingale herself. Westminster nurses they had been fully trained a full 9 years before Florence Nightingale set up her hospital in the Crimea. And the term a trained nurse was actually first used at Westminster Hospital. So I think it's fair to say that Westminster nurses were right there at the beginning of the nursing profession. We're moving on now. Here we have the Boer War at the end of the 19th century. And I've got a little picture here of Mr. A.E. Evans. He was a surgeon at Westminster Hospital, but he'd been a Westminster medical student as well. He was a top flight student. He won virtually every prize going when he was training. Highly regarded by his tutors because he had just finished his training and was beginning work as a junior house surgeon at Westminster Hospital when he was summoned in 1900 by his former tutor to Liverpool to join an army troop ship and a detachment of medics who were going out to South Africa. He didn't really have much choice in the matter, so he dutifully turned up at Liverpool and they set sail. And they were sailing on a troop ship called SS Winkfield. Well, they had quite an eventful journey to South Africa. About 2 days out of port before arriving in South Africa, they hit a fog bank. And disaster did strike in the form of a collision with a mail ship the the MS Mexican. And the Mexican fared very badly. 274 people ended up in the water, and 274 people were rescued. They were put aboard the SS Wingfield, no doubt well looked after by the medics on board, and they sailed back into South Africa, and those poor people finally found their way home on another ship. So that wasn't a terribly auspicious start to their campaign in South Africa. Things got more exciting still. The group of medical, the medical group set off with another detachment of soldiers to trek 1,300 miles across the South African veldt with mule trains. And I've found here a picture from the Imperial War Museum, actually, of a medical wagon pulled by mules, taken at the time. And the other picture, which is a little bit blurry, but so atmospheric, this is a troop of soldiers hauling their wagons and their mule trains up a mountain in the dust and the heat. And when they had been trekking for nearly 2 months, they were surrounded by a Boer commando detachment and captured and taken prisoner. They were taken prisoner for a week, along with a detachment of the Derbyshire Regiment, before they were finally rescued by some British troops. And they went on to serve a further year nursing wounded soldiers in that war, before finally returning home. And he returned a bit of a hero, actually. With an adventure like that, I'm not surprised. He went on to have a thoroughly distinguished career at Westminster Hospital, and he was actually pioneering in his operations on cancer of the esophagus. In 1909, he undertook a groundbreaking and very successful operation for cancer. He was hugely versatile in his surgery. He didn't really specialize and was enormously well loved. Everybody spoke highly of him. And it was said that his only fault was that he possessed not a shred of worldly ambition. So I think it was always felt that he could have really gone very far, but he was happy just to continue doing a wonderful job as a surgeon in Westminster Hospital. And of course, not long after the end of the Boer War, mere 13 years, we see the start of the Great War, the war to end all wars, which sadly it didn't. The First World War saw Westminster Hospital in action, but instead of sending nurses and medics out to the battlefields, the wounded soldiers were coming back to Westminster for care and recuperation. 150 beds were devoted at Westminster Hospital to the care of the war wounded. The medical hospital was taken over by the army to train army pathologists. And this photograph was taken in 1917 to commemorate the work that was going on for the war effort. And we have a fairly formal, relaxed, but fairly formal photograph taken on the steps of the hospital of some of the wounded patients and a couple of their little visitors, a little girl, she looks about 3 or 4, and a very pleased looking young chap, looks like he's in scout uniform, early days of the scouting movement, looking very pleased with himself. And we use this photograph a lot at the hospital. We've used it in the exhibition. We've used it in other publications that we've made because it's very atmospheric of the time. But what we've never really shown before is another photograph, clearly taken at the same time. And I want to show you this because I think it is really fascinating, and you can compare and contrast, see what you think. This next photo, I think, was taken a few minutes earlier. They're still sorting themselves out. Have a look at that. The medics are the chaps in the white coats at the back. They're still chatting amongst themselves. And we can see very clearly who those young visitors belong to. There's a chap with a bandage over his eye, clearly belongs to the young boy in the scout uniform who's looking very pleased with himself. And that little girl is very clearly with the gentleman with the cane beside him. I would venture to say it's his daughter. It's charming. The consultant in the long white coat on the far right is the only one who's paying attention to the photographer. He looks to me as if he's thinking, oh, hurry up, get on with this. I've got work to do on the wards. Everyone is chatting. There's a lot of jollity going on. And I think it reveals so much. It's such a natural moment. And then eventually they sort themselves out. Let's have another look at that photograph again. The formal one, the official photograph. And now we see they've all moved around because the young scout in the middle, we know he belongs, if you like, maybe he was a son or a brother of the chap on the far left with the eye bandage. And the little girl is quite happily sitting next to her father. And she hasn't moved, but the medics have gone back indoors and the consultant has left us. And we have the official photograph. I just think sometimes it's the unseen photograph which reveals so much when you start really looking at these old photographs. And then in 1919, there was another formal photograph session, but this time they took the nurses who had helped the hospital care for all those hundreds and hundreds of wounded soldiers. And what's so precious about this photograph, taken round the back, not on the front steps, what's so precious is that someone at some point in its history has taken the trouble to write in the names. So often we have these photographs and we've no idea who they are. But they've written across the top and down the sides, so we know roughly everyone's name. Sometimes they didn't know the name, so they've called across the back, the second one, the third one in from the left of the back row. She's called Sister King William. Now, King William was a ward. He was the first royal patron of the hospital. But obviously somebody couldn't remember her name, so she was just known as Sister King William. There's also Sister Mary Celeste. Mary Celeste was another ward name as well. Matron is in the middle row. She's the one facing towards the right of the photograph. She's facing a different direction. That was quite a common feature of these older formal photographs. The person who's in charge, or the most important person, was often facing at a different angle to everybody else, so you could pick them out. So that was Matron Edith Young. But it's a delightful picture, all in their very crisp uniforms. And of course, we come very soon afterwards to the Second World War. This time, of course, the war came very much to London. And so Westminster Hospital, being in the thick of everything, in the thick of the Blitz, was a key trauma hospital, receiving those who had been bombed out, the wounded, and actually taking several bomb hits itself. I'll speak about that in a moment. But because it was so much literally on the front line, there were many drills which took place practicing what they would do in an air raid. Now, of course, whereas we're used to the idea that during air raids, everybody went down to air raid shelters, but not the doctors and nurses in the hospital. They were just given tin helmets and had to carry on. So in the thick of a bombing raid, there they were, treating people as they came in. So I think this is a practice scramble to get to where they had to be when the air raid sirens went off, carrying their tin helmets. They're looking quite pleased with themselves. I think they're quite enjoying themselves. This was taken at a practice right at the beginning of the war in September 1939. By Christmas 1939, there was still what they were terming the phony war. Things hadn't quite kicked off, and celebrations were still going on. This is the children's ward, Princess Elizabeth Children's Ward, but you can see behind the Christmas tree, there's tape on the windows to try and protect the glass against bomb blasts. But that's a delightful picture. They're doing their best for those children in difficult times. And I like the little girl in the middle, gazing longingly, I think, at the angel at the top of the tree. But darker days came, and when the Blitz began and the incendiary bombs began to fall, the medical students were drafted in as volunteers on fire watching duty. And here we have two medical students keeping watch on the roof of Westminster Hospital. Westminster Hospital at the time was directly opposite Westminster Abbey. And I beg your pardon, no, it had moved by then, just moved. In 1939, the hospital had moved from Westminster Abbey to St John's Gardens and St John's Square. So here we have them on the roof, keeping a watch out for incendiary bombs. We have a lovely recording from a 94-year-old gentleman who was a medical student at Westminster during the war, who speaks of doing just this job. Apparently the medical students used to quite like volunteering for fire watch duty, because in the morning after a night shift on the roof, you got a free breakfast, and it was a rather good breakfast, and it kind of made it worthwhile spending a night on the roof. It was not without drama that he also spoke about an incendiary bomb actually falling on the roof, and his partner was quicker than him and scooped it up and put it in a bucket of sand and put it out, saved the hospital from burning. Meanwhile, during an air raid, the patients were often wheeled into inner corridors as being safer, further away from windows. Can you imagine the job of wheeling beds into the corridors at night for safekeeping? The nurses were working flat out throughout the war. But the hospital didn't escape unscathed. It was a brand new hospital, as I said, opened in 1939. It took a couple of bomb hits. One direct one destroyed the chapel, and this is the morning after, a rather bleak picture of the destruction. But miraculously, the girder, a steel girder in the building, deflected the bomb, and although it caused this damage, it didn't actually explode, and nobody was killed. There were no casualties. There were further bomb hits or near misses, and the worst of which came in 1943 when a landmine exploded right next door to the hospital and blew out every window in the top 3 floors, and all the windows in the nurses' home were blown out. There were a few injuries, though most notably a nurse who got commended by the trustees afterwards for her brave action. She got wounded by flying glass in her back because she was leaning over a cot to shield an infant patient. Such stories of heroism are very humbling, I think. And this is another very humbling story. Right at the end of the war, in 1945, just after the war had ended, groups of medical students from across London and 11 from Westminster Medical School volunteered to the Red Cross to go, what they thought was to go to the Netherlands to help feed starving civilians. But before they got there, they got diverted by the Red Cross to Belsen, which had just been liberated. And the Belsen concentration camp that they found when they got there, 2 days after it had been liberated, was an horrific sight. Relatives of one of this group still speaks of it. His cousin used to speak of it all his life. Possibly scarred them for life. That what they found when they got there was just unspeakable horror. They spent 12 days working flat out, and remember, these are only just qualified doctors. They had to remove the dead from the huts. They had to feed the barely alive. They had to deal with dysentery and cholera and typhoid. They had to try and feed those who were too weak to actually get to where the food had been left for them. They had to deal with appalling things. They were relieved after 12 days by the Royal Army Medical Corps and came home. The cousin of the person I spoke to about this actually contracted typhoid, TB, shortly after this, and he was only saved by some very new breakthrough drugs which came out about a year later. So it's an extraordinary experience which must have stayed with them all their lives, and what astounding young men they were. Such determination on their face. They didn't know what they were about to face. But the war came to an end and happier times returned. This is Christmas 1945. The Christmas shot I showed you earlier was in 1939. Here we are right at the end of the war. And the nurses resumed their Christmas tradition of singing Christmas carols round the wards on Christmas Eve. And this tradition went on for many, many years, and they would carry lanterns. And first of all, they would process in their capes. Their nursing capes had red linings. They've taken their capes off at this point, but they used to turn their capes inside out so the scarlet lining showed. And here they are singing carols. And it looks to me like the patient propping himself up on the far left of the picture is singing along too. And that is the end of our album. It's been lovely sharing this with you, and I hope you've enjoyed looking at the pictures. I've been humbled when I think of the work and the enterprise and the resilience of all those doctors and nurses who been working in incredibly difficult times and still do today and are right now in this current crisis that we're in. So this is my kind of dedication to the dedication of all those doctors and nurses over the centuries who look after us in times like this. Thank you ever so much for joining me. There will be another one of these albums shortly, and I'm going to be looking at the life of nurses through the centuries next time. So I hope you'll join me for that. It's been lovely to speak to you. Thank you very much.